Hey, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of Tell Me More. And I'm here today with Kate, who preached this last weekend.
What's up, everybody?
Now, in her sermon and in the Tuesday recap, we told all of you this would be coming out next week. And guess what? Gotcha. Plans have changed. And that happens.
What we learned in 2020 is we got to be fluid. You know what I mean?
Fluid,
so here we
flexible, and free. The 3 F's of 2020.
Yeah,
Some of you added in a 4th F, but that's not for this podcast. And I'm going to apologize in advance if my chair squeaks. See, here's the deal. Sometimes things you buy from Amazon break, and you fix them with materials they weren't designed for. And we got one of those situations going on today. So I apologize in advance if that happens. So today we're talking about the sermon from this past weekend. Kate talked about Esther and talked about fear. And I have a couple questions I'd like you to tell me more about from that, Kate.
Okay, I'll do what I can.
Yeah, you sure will. And your first question is, you mentioned anger as a secondary emotion. Tell me more about that. What is a secondary emotion and why does that matter?
Yeah, so a secondary emotion just means that when you feel that feeling, there's always another emotion with it. So anger is over top of that other emotion, and so that's it. It's just there's usually two feelings that come with it. There's another feeling as well that has been talked about, and I'm still learning a ton, as I talked about in the sermon. I'm learning a ton about emotions in the past 8 months. I've really been digging into this idea of the heart and loving the Lord our God with all of our hearts and figuring out what emotions are and tapping into them. And the second emotion that is never alone is glad. And so when we have glad, there's another emotion with it. Like there could be sadness because we know that our glad isn't going to stay forever. Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. So anyway.
Yeah, tell me more about that. Keep going. So glad and anger are the only two that come with multiple, huh?
Well, by definition, but I think we feel, so we're very complex creatures, you know, and our feelings, we have so many feelings all at the same time so often. And I think that's where it becomes very complicated for people because it's confusing when you've got for example, gladness, and you're feeling sad, and you've got some fear, all at the same time. And we don't know how to process those emotions. And I think often a lot of the reason why we don't know how to process our emotions is because when we're kids, we're told to stop it, stop having outbursts, or now is not the time, or go to your room if you're going to act that way. And so we're shamed into or berated into behavior modification rather than really learning about how to navigate our emotions in a responsible way. And that we don't have to know. A couple of weeks ago, I was just feeling really sad and I couldn't put my finger on what was going on. And the reality is that that's okay. It's what I said at the beginning of the sermon is none of the feelings are bad. They just are. And they're true until they're not true anymore. So I was sad and I couldn't really figure out what was going on inside of me to know why it was that I was sad, but I was okay with it. I just sat with the sadness and journaled about my sadness and talked to the Lord about it, and didn't shame myself or tell myself that I had to get over it. I just really was like, it's all right. You're not super excited right now and glad and full of joyful feelings, and that's okay. I'm here for you. I just sat with myself and talked about it with some people who I was close to and my small group, and we talked about, wanting to have answers for our feelings, and that sometimes there aren't always answers, and that's also okay.
So tell me a little bit more about processing emotions in a healthy way. You mentioned in the sermon, notice, make space, share. I'd love to hear a little bit more maybe about how you distinguish those. And then I would also be interested in hearing, are there any I guess, unhealthy ways that you would caution people from processing emotions, or even point out, hey, when we do these things, this is actually us dealing with emotions in unhealthy ways. So could you tell me more about maybe contrasting dealing with our emotions in a healthy manner and then dealing with them in an unhealthy manner?
Yeah, I mean, I can only talk from my experience, and that would be my experience of my own healthy and unhealthy responses, and then my interactions with people who might be doing it in a healthy or unhealthy way. But that's also only from my perspective. So I would say that for me, when I am processing my emotions poorly, which means I'm not processing them, I'm just reacting out of them. It comes out as defensiveness. I can be very guarded. And for my personality, I don't know if you know this about me, Alex, but I'm a pretty intense human being.
What?
I know. So I get really aggressive or intense or loud. I can yell. This is kind of a funny story. So I was a foster mom for a little bit over a year. I had 2 different kiddos. Mm-hmm. One of them came into my care and he was 7. And just a heads up, you guys, yelling at traumatized children is never a good idea. So I had this 7-year-old kiddo and I just loved him so much, but he would push my buttons. And honestly, before I got him, I grew up in a household that was yellers. We were very intense people. And I thought that I had gotten over my yelling issues. Mm. Mm-hmm, yeah. And then I had a kiddo in my life who pushed my buttons, and turns out I'm still a yeller. And so what was interesting about that situation, though, was that I was in therapy and he was in therapy. And my therapist told me it is better to err and repair than never to err at all. Because what I was able to do was to model healthy reparations. I was able to show him what it looks like to say, hey, listen, I yelled at you and that was not okay. And nobody deserves to be talked to that way. And I'm responsible for managing my emotions. And I didn't do a good job managing my anger and my fear. And so I guess that's an example of me not doing it well in unhealth. But what happens if I am responding in a healthy way, I'm able to communicate in that moment. I'm able to say, hey, I'm feeling some pretty big feelings right now, and I'd like to take a minute to step away from this situation and process through what I'm feeling. And sometimes you can't communicate that all right away. But it also happens when it's like really chill and you're in a meeting and you're with people and something happens and you have a physiological sensation in your body and you check in with yourself. You notice that's all it is just saying like, oh, I'm having some feelings right now. What's that about? And sometimes you can't process it in that moment, but you just notice it and you say like, okay, you got a tightness in your gut and you are feeling some type of way and you're like, okay, I need to not respond right now. And then later on in the day or the night or whatever, you take a minute for yourself and you can even excuse yourself. I think that so often we get caught up in the experience that we forget that we can revisit a conversation. We can step away from a meeting and say, you know what, I just need a second. I need to use the restroom. I need to get some water, like whatever you need to do to create space for yourself to be able to interact well. It's better than needing to come back and be like, whoa, sorry that I screamed at you. That wasn't cool. Yeah,
that's good. That's good. Now, you didn't have to talk about fear or feelings when we asked you to preach on this. You were just talking about Esther.
Yeah.
And so what in the scripture, after you'd read through the book a couple times, I remember you saying, okay, I'm landing on fear. I'm landing on feelings. This is what I'm going to talk about. Why was that? What were the things that stood out to you, both in the scripture and for our people, that made you go like, okay, this is what I got to do?
Yeah, totally. So what I think is so interesting is in our whole entire world, we don't talk at length about feelings except that they're bad, or you need to ignore that, or don't be led by that. But Esther was actually led by her fear. She made some pretty serious decisions and recognized what her fear could mean. And then because she knew the truth of what the consequences could be for her, she was able to make a wise and faithful decision, not because of death, but she was able to say, like, this is real. But then the other part of it was that we all have feelings. We all experience these significant emotional, they can feel really burdensome and overwhelming, and we don't know how to communicate about them. We don't have this like common language, because so many people just ignore. They just don't understand what is going on inside of them. And so I think that scripture, I was reading through Esther, and every single person has feelings in the book of Esther. You know, they all do. And so I just couldn't help but see that, you know, there was a common thread of this fear throughout King Xerxes, and even Queen Vashti, who is like a minimal character. And then the wise people, the wise dudes
the wise guys.
Yeah, the wise guys that King Xerxes reflected with and was like, hey guys, what do I do? They're like, oh my gosh, well, you can't let people see Queen disobey you, because then other women are going to think they can do that too. There's just this like common thread. Haman and Mordecai, everybody is just showing up with fear and other feelings too. And we just don't talk very well about feelings. I haven't heard. And my experience with the church, I will admit, is very minimal. And that's not like just this church or that church, but in general, this idea of people don't really know how to communicate and articulate about their feelings without either ignoring them or being consumed by them. And so I thought, like, I really want to talk to people about fear and the gift that it can be when we understand, or maybe not even understand what we're fearful of, but make space for it so we can respond better.
Right.
Because in our world right now, I mean, people are just eaten alive by their emotions and by fear. And they don't have good language to understand what's going on inside of them.
Right. And we had talked a little bit about this at staff meeting. I think it was staff meeting. Maybe it was, I was talking with someone else actually. Anyway, we talked about World Wars I and II, and we talked about how, you know, our grandparents were raised by veterans who survived the First World War. And like my grandpa had a very absent, his dad was physically present because he survived the war, but he was totally absent emotionally. He wasn't present in the home. He wasn't there for his kids. He didn't really know how to raise them because he'd just been so shell-shocked by World War I. And then my grandpa was in World War II. And our grandparents' generation are survivors of World War II. And so our parents were also raised by war survivors. And then you have the Vietnam War and their generation. And trauma definitely, feelings are a part of kind of a full human experience. And they're not necessarily necessary for survival. And so when we're put in these positions where it's survive or die, we tend to repress our feelings or throw them away or not totally trust them in order to survive. And or we throw them away or are consumed by them. I think those are two helpful categories: being consumed by them or repressing them totally. Again, in order to survive or as a response to some survival that we have experienced. And so, you know, I don't think that this is necessarily new information in terms of world history, but in American history over the past 100 years, the pandemic is the most traumatic thing, probably outside of 9/11, to happen to our generation. And, you know, we have not, even in the pandemic, necessarily been put in those same situations of survival. And I think that we've seen the negative impact this has had on our culture, on our parents, on our grandparents, on the way that lots of things in American history over the last 100 years have been determined by these things. And I'm really interested in the midst of that. You mentioned two categories: consuming, and then what was the second one you said? You didn't use repressing. I'm using that word. would you say we get consumed by our feelings or
ignore them?
Ignore them. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, you and I both like the Enneagram. Big fan.
Yes, we do. Yep.
And
helpful tool.
It really is.
Yeah.
And on the Enneagram, different numbers tend to have a first response, not just of certain emotions, but also of ways to deal with them. So 3, 6, and 9 all tend to repress. And then the rest of the numbers tend to be consumed by them either outwardly by externalizing in an attacking way or in a blaming way, or internalizing in an attacking and a blaming way. That, you know, I'm attacking myself with those things. So you're an 8.
Yes. Yes, I do identify most with the 8 on the Enneagram. Yeah.
Strong wing 7, though, right?
Strong wing 7. That's why I'm so much fun. I'm very, very intense, and I want to bring everybody with me. Yeah.
We're gonna have the most intense fun, and you're all gonna come.
And you guys are you're gonna like it. You're gonna do it, and you're gonna like it.
And if you don't, anyway,
good luck.
We won't go there.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in the ways that would you say you tend to be consumed by your emotions or ignore them? And I'm interested is a number that tends to express those emotions. Where have you seen yourself ignore them? Or are there certain pockets?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that for me, I misidentified as a type 7 for about 4 or 5 years because I tested high 7, high 8, and was like a 7 higher than the 8, but by like 0.2%. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm definitely a 7. Totally. I'm super fun. And it's really interesting. That's a different podcast. I'll focus here. But so I ignored pain and suffering quite a bit, because it made me feel weak. And it made me feel like I didn't have any control, not because I had a hard time with pain and suffering, because I was fine with it until it felt like it was going to take me down or other people were going to use it against me. That was really painful for me too. As long as I was in control of who was going to hear about my pain and suffering, it was fine with me. I don't care. I'm an open book. I don't have any problem sharing all about the hardships in my life. But anger is most comfortable for me. And what I learned about anger is not actually a bad thing. When we tap into our anger, it actually leads to passion. And so when people have conversation with me and I'm super intense about which way the toilet paper roll needs to go, my intensity is just like a passion. I sound way more intense and passionate than I actually probably am, because I have so much energy to use that it just comes out as, it feels hard for people. And I didn't know that was because wherever I am, there I am. So I just like am always with myself, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is fine. Everybody behaves this way. And that's what the Enneagram has helped me to see, that not everybody thinks the same or sees the world through the same lens or has the same needs. And so the Enneagram has been really helpful for that. Some of the other feelings that are really hard for me are fear. I talked about that in the sermon. I'm not a fearful person when it comes to like external things. Like I don't ever think about danger, because I'm like, well, I'll just fight back, or I'll just get away, or I'm not sure. My good friend Amy said to me this past weekend, if you had a little bit more fear, other people wouldn't probably tell you all the bad things that could happen, because you would already think about it and they wouldn't need to do that for you. That's an interesting way of thinking about that. Yeah.
That's funny.
And then I would say shame is something that I struggle to actually see in myself, and loneliness.
I think you just hit on something really important there.
Yeah.
I think that it's a sign that you are ignoring a feeling when you can't see it in yourself. Yeah. I think that that's really important as just like a takeaway from this podcast is if there's a certain emotion, be it something like gladness or something like shame or anger or fear, it doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means you're not paying attention.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's really important, because that to me was a tool to determine like, oh, well, what things am I ignoring? It turns out most of them, but
thank you for showing up, Alex. I appreciate that. And I think that when we talk about these feelings, so many people are like, well, I don't have any guilt and I don't have any shame and I'm not fearful. I would say that you're ignoring your feelings, because those aren't bad things. When you look at the list and you see anger and hurt and loneliness and sadness and fear and shame and guilt and gladness, out of all of those, people think that glad is the only good one. And the truth is that they're all good because they all have a gift attached to them. And it's a beautiful thing when we're able to show up to ourselves and notice that we're having these feelings. Because like I said in the sermon, if we don't see these feelings, they're going to show up again. They're going to show up in a different format, whether it's you had these feelings in your family of origin and you never dealt with them. And now you're in a work environment and there's somebody who behaves like your brother or your dad or your sister. And now you're feeling these feelings again and you're behaving the same way you did in your family of origin. And you never dealt with it. And so I think that's what it means when, in scripture, there's so many stories in scripture about people who don't deal with themselves. And then they continue to experience the same lessons until they learn what God has to teach them. That's the transformation process, right? That's what we're called to do, is to be transformed in our minds, to represent and look like Jesus. And he was in tune. He was in tune with all of his feelings.
He cries in grief. He cries in sadness. He sweats blood and fear.
He's fearful. He's angry. I mean, he's got he feels hurt and loneliness. All of them. He feels them, which is how we know that feelings aren't bad, because Jesus was without sin. And if he does these things and he meets them and he takes time every morning to go away to lonely places, to be with the Lord and to process, to make space. Jesus always made space to work through what was going on inside of himself and to connect to the Lord. So,
so that taps into another question I wanted to ask you. There's a misconception that some of the things that I think are popular have been made popular in the last 5 to 10 years. Things like the Enneagram or things like talking about feelings, that there's some kind of vogue thing, but they're not actually scriptural or they're not actually spiritual. And I think that that's incredibly false because, as you just mentioned, feelings are part of the human experience, and scripture's about people and God, both whom have feelings. And so feelings are always a part of scripture, because these things are not happening in a vacuum. They're happening with real people in a real place. And one of the people you kind of hinted at was, Abraham, for example, is afraid of never having an heir. And he's afraid of God's promise to him not becoming fulfilled. And that's such a compelling promise. He leaves his family, and in a day and age when you didn't do that, and he just heads a cardinal direction. Just like, head northwest. Okay. And he does. And that's so compelling. He leaves everything. And of course, we see God does provide that heir and does provide that nation, albeit not all in his lifetime. Are there any other scriptures that have been, other than the book of Esther, important to you or instructive for you when learning how to deal with feelings in a way that honors God?
Well, I think that if you look at the story of Moses, you just see the way that he interacts with his feelings too. And he has fear, and he has loneliness, and he has anger. And I think that, the verse where he is meets the angel of the Lord, which is actually God, and he wrestles with him. He's like, I'm not going to let you go. Like, I see anger there. And that leads him to getting something from God, which is, a new name and a promise. And it's just so beautiful to me. And then also the whole book of Romans, it's super, I think that part of what I love about Romans is the intensity of it. didn't know it was intense until I would like talk to people about it. But there's just this like sanctifying rhythm to the book of Romans that is feelings throughout the whole book. I can't help but just like adore it. I just think it's
yeah, I really love the book of Romans, and I love it seems like Paul was a pretty good pastor, because he didn't write Romans to another church because he was actually with all those other churches. Right? The church in Rome is the only church he didn't like physically get to go to and plant, because he was in chains by the time he made it to Rome. But when he was in Rome, he was under house arrest. He was not church planting. Yeah. And so he just kind of wrote like, this is everything I would tell you about how to follow Jesus. Yeah. And they were a non-Jewish church. They were a Gentile church, right? Yeah. And some of the other churches he planted began with Jews who knew a lot of the Hebrew scriptures. But anyway, I think that's why traditionally the West has enjoyed Romans, is we are its target audience. We are the Gentiles who didn't get to get our church planted by Paul, and who aren't Jews and don't get some of the background and connective tissue. So as he explains it to older Gentiles who are like that, I think that we resonate with that, because we're like,
the other book that I would say, or at least the Ecclesiastes, where it talks about there's a time for everything. Yeah. I think that's so pivotal to understanding. Like if you have sadness, if you're mourning, if you're celebrating, if you're dying, if you're dealing with all these things, there is a time for that. It's not saying get over it. It doesn't say ignore that or be consumed by it. It says that there's a time for these things, and that's okay, and that we have to look at it, and we have to experience it, and we have to hold space for other people who are doing these things. Right. But I think so often what happens, and I'm starting to get really passionate about this specifically because I was so garbage at it. I have been so bad at when people come to me with their feelings, telling them ways of getting over their feelings, instead of just saying, gosh, that I have felt that way too. What do you need from me? Like when you're suffering, when you're sad, everybody has different things that they need. And so often people don't even know what they need, but to tell them, I'm actually a person that isn't going to try to fix you. I'm just going to be here with you. Oh my gosh, it's so powerful, because instead of saying ignorant or condescending statements, you're able to just truly connect with people and share in their loneliness and their sadness and their shame or gladness, even celebrating with people. So I just feel like we don't do a good job of this because we don't do it well for ourselves. And until I'm able to really do it well within my own soul, within my own spirit, and before the Lord, I'm not going to be able to do it with other people. And so learning how to do that is really, really important. And I am by far 0% of an expert at this. I have like so much room for growth, and I desperately want to honor the Lord and love his people and just really learn about how to do this well and be a church community who does that. But I can't do that until I am doing it for myself. And that's why this group that I mentioned at the end of my sermon, this plumb line, it's been a really great space for me to learn about what that looks like and how to do that well. So I'm trying. I fail pretty regularly, but I'm trying, pick it up and do it again.
I think that's part of learning, that's and that's Jesus's way of learning. That's a different podcast, but put people through classes.
Yes.
He put people through life.
Yep.
Anyway, I wanted to know, there are a couple points in your sermon you mentioned. I don't have time to talk about this. I'd like to say more on this, but I can't. Are there any things now, a couple of days later, that you wish you could have talked about and you just didn't have time to?
Yeah, I think, I could talk about feelings for a really long time, I think. The one thing that I will say that I really, really wanted to touch on, but it was a whole different sermon. Also, side note, the hands thing, I've got to get better at like flailing my hands about. I don't know. It's like
it's
I
the
talk
intensity.
With them. Yeah, it's like gotta come out somewhere. Here it is. Do not fear. Do not fear. People say that all the time, and it is in Scripture. It is all throughout Scripture. But I would beg of people that when they are reading that, to not put the inner critic behind that command, and that they would read that Scripture in context. Because every time that I found, and I wanted to do a whole inductive study in preparation for the sermon, but then when I realized that was a different sermon, and so I should probably table it and do it later. So I found like 6 different places in Scripture in my like brief preview.
Yeah.
And it was always, do not fear, for the Lord is with you. Fear not, for I am your Redeemer. It was never this like condemning, shaming, don't do that, like berating mother or condemning father. It was this, don't be afraid. I'm here for you. I am with you. I can connect with you in your fear. You don't have to do that by yourself. And so often I think that we feel like, I'll just speak for myself. So often I feel like if I am fearful, then I'm doing it wrong, that there's something that I'm missing. And the truth is that I don't have to do it by myself. That when I'm scared, I have some really solid, stellar human beings in my life that I can show up to and say, I've got some fear about this. And they are able to say, that makes sense. Let's talk it out. Let's talk it out. And what's the worst thing that can happen? And then playing the tape all the way through, and then saying, but what's probably going to happen? And then being able to release that fear and, or just to hold it and say, like, that might happen. And that would be really tragic, but usually it's not going to happen.
I don't know what Plumline would say about this because I'm not in the group, but it seems
you're more than welcome to join. I'm happy to provide a link for you to check it out.
But fear seems to me to always be associated with loss. That fear is the self-preservation to avoid a losing of something, either a losing of a circumstance, maybe a privilege of some kind, a relationship perhaps, time, or a perception of how much or how little we have of it, productivity perhaps, and obviously in its most extreme form, life. And, the Lord spoke to me a lot about that over the past couple of years, that those scriptures of do not be afraid, for I am with you. Yeah. And, the reason he said that is they were afraid. And because whatever was happening,
it was scary. It was a scary thing.
Be it his presence or the circumstance or both.
Yeah.
Right. And, the presence of the Lord is terrifying. And I feel like I got just a great picture of that living at Bear Lake, because there would be storms that were wild, like really, 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 really intense storms. We were right on a lake. And so the lake effect added to whatever storm it was, be it a blizzard or be it like a thunderstorm. I remember there were times, Did
you guys ever see a tornado?
Yes. Not there though. In Canton, actually.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I remember that one. Yeah. It went through Grass Lake.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That's Marcy. I've got a friend who was living there. She was hiding in her basement. And honestly, this is kind of funny. I made fun of her.
Oh, really?
I was like, why are you so scared? It's ridiculous. You're going to be fine. Because she wasn't going to come. We had like a meeting at the church, and I like shamed her. And then it ended up that it was a real tornado. And I was like, ooh glad that you stayed home in the basement, because that's terrible. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
So anyway, the Lord's presence is terrifying, but it's not malicious. Right. And I think that being in those storms just showed me what's so scary is how little control you have. In most situations, you can figure out a way to have some semblance of influence. That like as a kid, if I cry or I scream, then that's going to affect your behavior. But there's this powerlessness that comes with something like a strong storm of nothing I do has any influence or bearing on what's going to happen next. You are like totally separate from me. And then the magnitude of and difference of power is terrifying. And I think the presence of the Lord is like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think that I would agree that his "do not be afraid" is not a chastisement of fear.
Yeah.
He's simply saying this situation, because I'm with you, is not a situation where you're going to lose something.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a situation where you're going to lose your life or lose, this is almost like a providing hidden information.
Well, it's protection, it's help, right? Which I talked about in the sermon is what we need. We need refuge and protection and help. We need a support and from people and from the Lord. And when the gift of fear is faith and wisdom, but when fear goes unmet and it's impaired, then it leads, just like Mordecai, just like Haman, to control, manipulation. It leads to anxiety. But when fear is left in isolation, and this is something that we learn about that I have learned about in Plumline, he talks about how fear leads to rage. It leads us to, which is what Haman did, right? He had this fear of the Jewish people because they wouldn't submit, they wouldn't bow down, and it led to him writing out this edict where he's going to create genocide. He's going to kill out all of these people because he's so scared of them overruling and creating this, what's it called when people take over?
Coup.
Yeah, where they're going to take over. And so he's got so much fear that it leads him to be enraged at the Jewish people. It's the same thing as a kid who comes in and shoots up a school. That kid has loneliness and he's got fear of being rejected and unloved and in isolation.
Right. I'm going to hurt you before you can hurt me.
Yeah. Right. So I don't know. It's just, I think that there's so much value in our community, in our country, to be able to really assess, like, what are the feelings behind what you're talking about right now? And in our church, when we're making big decisions about what we're going to be doing and what's your small group going through together, there's going to be feelings that come up. And if we don't talk about those things, we take our ball and we go home, or we attack other people. And I just think that if we're able to really process through and notice in ourselves what's going on and deal with those things in a really good way and share about them in a safe place, we're going to be able to be better followers of Christ. We're going to be a better witness for the world around us, because right now, I'm going to be so honest, we're not a super great witness because we can't even get along with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that just breaks my heart. And I have people in my life who do not love Jesus who have said that to me. Like, no offense, but you guys don't do a really great job of loving people. And I'm like, well, I do. I work really hard to love people. But yeah, so anyway, I want to be a part of a church community that's really digging into this stuff and really building up their community, from the inside out. And like we learned about with Pete Cesaro, and that there's one devotion that he talks about, he quoted somebody else, I wanted to change the whole world. And this is so funny to me, but I want to change the whole world. And then he goes through all these different things. And he says, like, at the end of the day, I wish I would have just worked on changing myself, because then maybe I could have changed the world. Yeah. And I think that's really powerful. Yeah, I totally agree. Well, is there anything you want to leave us with as we close here about feelings or fear? I think I've said quite a bit, and I could talk about this. I could talk about this for hours. So if anybody wants to talk about this for hours, give me a call. Thanks, Alex. 1-800 talk about feelings. Not a real phone number. Don't call that. Yeah, don't. Well, thanks for joining us today, Kate, and thanks for your work on the sermon. I thought you did a great job showing us how the humanity in these characters. This wasn't just a historical event, and this isn't some far off Bible story. These are real people that were dealing with real life and met a real God in those things. And through small acts of obedience and through facing the things they were feeling, God used them to preserve his people and shift the course of history. And so thank you for showing us that. Thank you for talking more about that. And we will see you guys next week. If there are topics that are not sermons that you'd like us to cover or talk about,
This podcast is for you. It's not for us. We have conversations like this on our own without this.
Yeah, we do.
But this is for you. So you can shoot us a message on Facebook, or comment on our posts where we post these videos on Facebook or on YouTube. And we'll be sure to try to hit some of those things for you, because we're here to follow Jesus and we're here to learn from each other and do it together. So we'll see you next week. Thank you very much, Kate. And have a great week, guys.
Bye.